observative. So I think it's a little bit like when I drive or walk, I will see everything. It's like I'm walking with a partner and I was like, did you see this? Did you see that? And they didn't see it and I see it, everything. So I noticed for myself that I'm extremely observative. And I think that is my drive for my inspiration. I pick up smell, colors, and emotions, combining to the smell and observations in a second, and I relate that right away to an image. It's something I had at a real young age, and I've always been drawing and painting since I was very young. Yeah, this is still going on. I mean, I'm 60 now, but it's still going on, you know. I just pick up from driving. I don't pick up from sitting on the same place. So I'm really someone who has to go for walks, go for a drive, go for a bike ride. And that's where I got my inspiration from. Although in the beginning it was always abstract, right now I'm more drawn to more realistic things. I still, you know, when I'm thinking about a sunflower, I mean, or the smell and the form, sometimes, you know, dreams or thoughts, and they also create images for me. But then when you walk and you have that smell or you see that, you know, say sunflower, then it comes together. And so then I go back to the studio and it's, you know, start creating, and that's where it is. Well, I basically displaced myself by, I'm from the Netherlands and moved to the United States. So that's why I always say I displaced myself. I got myself out of my comfortable environment into a new environment where I didn't know the language. I didn't know the people. I didn't know the nature. Everything is different. The climate is different. I think when you talk about place, you know, you try to find that place back, what makes you comfortable, to look for recognizable points, to make myself back feeling at home, that my place. So when I go, say, from my house to the studio, I always look for points like, oh, that's a road sign. Oh, that yellow car. I look for those points, what makes me feel like, oh yeah, this is where I am. This is my place. This is where my home is right now. And I also do it when I go on vacation. I try to find right away, you know, little points like at the little house where you stay or the boat or wherever, to make it right away my place, my home for that little period. Well, when I was younger, you imagined the future being 14, no, 18, I can drive or that kind of stuff. But when you get older, the future is next week or a couple of days. So in that case, that's, you know, imagine the future. But when you talk about environment, I mean, yeah, that worries me. It's a world where people don't realize anymore what we're doing to the world. Plastic, all the trash everywhere contains so much particles, what gets in our soil and what we're eating. And I think the most important goal is that we start teaching, you know, more and more about what we're doing. Try to change. That's one of my goals of my art too. That's why I pick up that county road, that little fall apart house, because I want to tell people, you can change this, you can change your community. And yeah, I like to be that world famous artist, but I realize a lot of times when you work in your community and work with the community and teach the youth about what you're seeing and what you can change, I think you can do a lot of good things. And even if you touch just one person's life and that spreads to two other people, and, you know, the famous thing, imagine your future, I think that's one of the goals we have to set ourselves, and try to get better and embrace nature.
Being an artist from Oklahoma, born and raised in Shawnee, I also was raised a little bit on the Navajo reservation. And so growing up here and partially grown up there as a child, the environment is very different. So the desert, you have shrubs and sagebrush and a lot of dirt and sand, and it's dry and it's hot. And it's really cold, bitter cold in the winter. Oklahoma has lots of trees and greenery and humidity and lots of wildlife too. When you're, especially in the spring, you can hear the cicadas and the tree frogs. But back home on the reservation, Navajo reservation, you hear mostly the wind, sometimes crickets, but not too much. So it's very different. So a lot of the artwork that I produce is for both areas, both of my Native Indigenous backgrounds. Just in this piece here, I caught a image of a red-tailed hawk about to take off on my way home from work. And I enjoy stopping and taking photos of flowers, of nature, anything that I think is really neat. I will use as a reference later in another piece. I have plenty more references and plenty more art to create from those photos. So I really enjoy being out in nature, and I try to incorporate that since a lot of Native culture is based around nature and our connection to Mother Earth and Father Sky. So I really enjoy being in that in-between of the living creatures and the grass and trees. So if I see a really nice flower or a really neat creature, I usually stop and try to take a picture of it. That's how Oklahoma has shaped me. My father always used to take us out and he'd collect cane to create his native flutes. And he'd always take pictures. So we have tons of photo albums of just sunsets and photos of nature. So I was kind of raised around that as well. Place for me is very important. Growing up as I did traditionally and learning about the history of Native people and where my Native people and ancestors are from, to me it's very important to visit those places. There's still a couple of places I've never visited that is where my ancestors walked, near the Great Lakes area. And even my maiden name Dubois comes from Normandy, France. And I would love to go over there visiting and connecting and walking the same area that those ancestors are from. And then for myself, it's because of the earth. We use a lot of natural native spirituality. We talk about Mother Earth and where she's from and these things. So I've always learned to be respectful of these areas and these beings that may reside there, and we incorporate that. So place is very important, being connected to the earth. Even in some of our ceremonies, it's always dirt floors or dirt ground because that's how it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be stepping and walking on that earth versus like tile or concrete and things like that when we do our ceremonies. So it's always it's the dirt, it's the earth there. In our Sac and Fox Sweat Lodge, you just put some padding down, but there's earth just right underneath there. And even our Navajo ceremonies with our hogans, they're traditionally dirt floors, and that's how it's supposed to be. So place to me is very important. There's significance to various locations, and I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to like very beautiful areas, or they walk into nature and they're like, wow, look at this. And I think we're connected to that. I think sometimes technology and sometimes living in the city may distort that. So I think it's good for people to get away and spend some time playing in the river or hanging out the lake or going to the ocean, hiking mountain trails, but also being respectful of those places because they can be dangerous. So always giving thanks and being connected in that way. So I think it's all about being respectful, not just to people, but to our nature and the things around us. A lot of my creativity, I believe, comes from my family. So I grew up very traditional in my native cultures of Navajo, Sac and Fox, Prairie Band Potawatomi, and around a lot of Native people. And I've learned a lot as a kid. And I enjoy telling this story that one of the first ceremonies I remember as a child was a sand painting ceremony. And I was very young, but I have glimpses and memories of sitting there. It was kind of dark, but seeing the healer and the medicine man and hearing the chanting and participating in that very, very young. So I've definitely have that connection to my native culture. And growing up, I was around a lot of creative people. My mother's side, Navajo weavers, Navajo silversmith makers, and watching them make those and helping them and try the art form as a kid and seeing if I liked it or not. And then on my father's side, learning about sewing and learning how to make Sac and Fox and Potawatomi ribbon skirts and shawls and learning how to do that. But even though I've had and knew all these art forms and I tried all of them and I can do most of them, they just weren't my creative outlet. And it wasn't until I got to middle school to high school, I had a great mentor who really saw that potential and allowed me to experiment with different mediums. I tried clay and other 3D forms, but I was really stuck to oil painting and mixed media pieces. So that was the direction I ended up going into. And I really enjoy those mediums. It gives me the most control. Sometimes I see things other people don't, which to me is normal. Just like looking at the mesas and I can distinguish different colors. I've been getting more into digital media a little bit, digital illustration, so that's a new medium for me. But it helps me, I think, with my more traditional art forms. Just whatever comes to mind, I try to document in my own way of how I see it. So some of my pieces may be more spiritual, mythical looking, and then others are more nature, just the way I see it, just like this piece here. And I try to include native language within the titles as well, or within the piece somewhere. So just trying to tie in all of my cultures and then just things I enjoy or see in everyday life.
As a member of the Little Ox community growing up here where this place resides, it's really important to understand the rural attributes of the city and really how the town is brought up with farm life and agriculture and how that gardening process really brings the community together, especially at the resource center. And I think it's honestly an incredible idea to bring the arts in as well. And with urban sprawl, it's even more important to bring together those attributes. The backstory behind the purple coneflower piece, I was actually on a trip, I believe in 2018 with my mom. We were visiting our family and she wanted to take me to Philly because it was the town that she really blossomed and became her own person. And there's just a massive arts and culture in the town. And it was actually one of the first photos that I took there. I've had a camera since I was 7, even though it took me a long time to gain that experience. I saw this bee on this really pretty flower and I was like, I just caught the right perspective. And sometimes that's really what art is all about, seeing the right angles and at the right time. And it's just the vibrant colors. And after a while looking back at it, I realized it really captures this symbiotic relationship between plants and wildlife. And without these creatures, these bees pollinating our plants, we wouldn't even have half the diversity of our planet or our resources. So I think it's a really important piece in terms of environmental science and arts as well. I think the biggest inspiration is passion and just the drive to articulate all the beauty in the world. And especially when it comes to my personal photography, a lot of that is driven from nature and just me walking around in my yard as a kid, just trying to find a good picture, looking around, looking for mushrooms or really cool branches with some flowers on it, just trying to find the right spot where the light hits it, and really all about where your eye takes you. I also find beauty in culture and music and just inspiration from all walks of life, honestly. But with this piece in particular, I think I was inspired by the city of Philadelphia itself, and as well as the art behind nature.
I began writing poetry in Oklahoma. I was born and raised here and got my master's in writing poetry here. However, I've been away 30 something years and just got back to the States in Oklahoma about 3 years ago. I originally wrote about people and experiences and what I was learning, but now I write much more about place, what passes outside my window, what I discover on my walks, all the things I see. I'm much more tied to where I am now rather than looking into my head for things to write about. I'm not sure what drives me to create. I just do. I have written poems most of my life, starting as a teenager a little bit. But then in my 20s, I read a lot of poetry. I wrote a little poetry, and I got more and more into it. And I've just been writing all the time. I can't seem to stop. But as far as my inspiration, that may come from anywhere or anything. I often walk around the lake and the nature preserve, looking for something to catch my eye. Reading the poetry of others often produces poems of my own. And being forced to write a poem every day, which I do with my online writing group every April and November, compels me to look deeper and broader and differently at my world to produce something meaningful. Nature is my biggest inspiration. I always take note of what I see, from animals to insects to plants. Like in February in Oklahoma, I looked at these little plants blooming out there in February. And wow, that's amazing. So I just look for inspiration everywhere. When I lived in Central America, the veranda was my place. I read and wrote there almost every day. Now I have a small lake behind my house, and if you read my work, you'll recognize that lake features prominently in my poetry. In fact, before I left the States, I lived right behind 7 wetland lakes in a protected heron sanctuary. I often just looked out the window or walked around and wrote about what I saw there. As to the current lake, I was composing February in Oklahoma in my head that morning while walking around the lake. I didn't have my notebook with me, but I was just thinking about these lines. And it was actually the first poem that I wrote in this new house. I had moved there a couple of months earlier, and then there's all that setting up and everything. So this was a nice warm t-shirt day in February, and I walked around the lake and looked at things, and as I said, composed this poem in my head. Place, especially now, is a very big component of what I write about.
All of my poetry, and I do additional writing and essays, they're all based on very personal experiences, and all of those experiences have been prompted by nature. With the poem Aeolus about the red-tailed hawk, this was actually written, it says it was finished in 2021, but it actually began sometime in 1970 or so. It's about me maturing as a person more than it is about the bird dying. And the red-tailed hawk was a chick, and it had been taken out of the nest by a person, and they shouldn't have done that, because you cannot at that age provide the proper warmth, because the birds cannot produce their own warmth at that age. Adult birds, as most of us know, are warm-blooded, but when they're at that age, they're not, and they require the parent's assistance to keep warm. Plus, they need to get food that are fit for baby red-tailed hawks. So this person made a mistake and wanted me to take it and do something. There was nothing that could be done for the bird. And so it died basically in front of me. And I thought, this bird has no chance. So the poem is about what the bird might have become. Will it ever fly? Will it ever build a nest? Will it ever mate? Could it become a falconer's bird? And of course, the answer to these questions is no. But I've really applied those questions to myself. What am I going to do when I'm about 21 or 22 years old at this time, like this bird? Will I fly, so to speak? Will I go out into the world? Will I go other places and see other things? So the story is a fictional story about a real bird that's dying, and a non-fictional story about me, the human, who is wondering what that future might be. I lived in North Dakota, in the prairie, in a research station that was actually on a prairie called Oakville Prairie. Living out there, struck by what is a prairie? And, where are prairies today? Fortunately for that prairie, it's still there, and that's good. But most of our prairies haven't just disappeared, although people think that. They've been destroyed by human activity. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but I'm going to pick one out and say that 90% of the prairies that we've had in the United States and elsewhere are probably gone. And so we have remnant prairies. And if you think of the tallgrass prairie in northeastern Oklahoma, that's 50,000 or so acres, I think, that's been saved as a tallgrass prairie. And there are darn few of those other areas around. There's one in Kansas, and there are some natural areas that in private ranches and so forth that have these prairies. But by and large, the prairies are gone. The poem is about prairies, what makes them up, what happened to them a little bit, how they influence me and perhaps other people that have the opportunity to know a prairie. It focuses on the wildflowers, but it makes connections to all the other things that make up a prairie. The soil. If you look at a prairie, you see grass and weeds and flowers and brush. There aren't any trees for the most part. There aren't any caves. The hills aren't there for the most part, low hills, but it's flat. But a lot of the prairie is under the ground. There are animals that burrow under the ground. Why? Because they have to get away from the predators that are above the ground. And if you dig up bluestem grass, which we have here, right out around in Oklahoma, little bluestem in particular, grows in this area that is called the cross timbers, which is partly prairie and partly sort of a thorny forest. Digging up little bluestem grass, you would find out that the roots go down not just a little bit, but a long, long ways. And in some cases, some of these prairie plants have roots that are 10 feet deep. That's what held the prairie together and why it was so rich when we began to plow it up. So the poem looks at the wildflowers from a lot of different angles. It asks questions about what are we going to do with the prairie, and it talks about a little prairie that I tried to recreate in my own yard, which is basically impossible. But you can feel some of it, of course, or see some of it through some of the flowers that are there, and the grasses too, that wave in the wind. And some more insects come, and maybe some birds come if you have enough space that you wouldn't normally see. And also, where do you find prairie today? You might find it right out here in terms of little tiny pieces, remnants, and some of these prairie patches and flowers are still there. It looks at the prairies from a bunch of different angles. It takes you on a little journey where I fly across the prairie as one of the hawks that live there, and playing tag with turkey vultures, and it's imaginative and this sort of thing, but it sort of boils down to what the spirit that you can get from the prairie. If you sit in a prairie or even a little patch, you get to feel the wind, and you can let yourself go with the wind, or you can imagine that you are a hawk and that you're sailing around. You can see this. So, and it brings you back down to earth to what the spirit of the prairie can do, and what your spirit can do if you let the prairie actually speak to you or influence you. My thoughts about place specifically are two. One is there's your physical place, of course. And so I've moved around a bit. I lived in Massachusetts and North Dakota and Virginia and out here in Oklahoma. I've been, I think, to all 50 states, and I've been to 25 countries or so. So I've seen other places and other people in them and other plants and animals and environments. I haven't seen everything, but I've seen enough to know sort of the spread. So there's your physical place, and that obviously is influencing you. You can't escape your senses. Even if you spend all your time inside, it's kind of difficult to be totally unaware of everything. The physical place has always been important to me. It's always immersed myself from the time I was a little kid, running around in the woods, collecting critters and things, going on nature hikes. So there's that kind of a place. Then secondly, there's your brain place. Where is your mind? So there are all these things that if you just let yourself look around and observe, you'll find those things. And if you get comfortable enough with them, and that's part of the point of the wildflower poem, then you're able to daydream.
So I have two different poems. One is Smelling the Storms, and the other is Pecan Picking. And they're both kind of centered around the rituals and rhythms of me having grown up on a farm, and what I sort of noticed there growing up. Smelling the Storms is kind of about the ritual of what I saw as my family's preparation when we knew a storm was coming. We were a farming family, so often if we knew a bad storm was coming, we'd be hurrying in from the fields or trying to get hay in the barn and just trying to beat the storm back. And then once we get back to the house, it was sort of like the ritual would continue. You might hurry to get your clothes in off the clothesline, kind of get ready to go to the cellar if you needed to, maybe call a relative or a neighbor to make sure they knew the storm was coming. But also, it struck me how thunderstorms kind of engage all of our senses. I kind of had the image of a deer. I've seen deer, stand really still in the woods, so they're, maybe trying to hear or see or smell any possible danger. So I had the idea to use that image as our reaction, our human reaction to a thunderstorm. And as I said in the poem, we place our noses on the breeze to discern the danger. And then pecan picking, I wanted to capture sort of the rhythm of what I felt. So growing up on the farm, we have lots of pecan trees. And I kind of wrote the poem from the vantage point of the pecan trees themselves, of them noticing sort of this multi-generational response to gathering pecans. So, them watching what we were doing, and we were watching throughout the year to see how the pecans were looking, and then you notice them start to fall, and then you go out with your buckets and pick up the pecans, and just the generational part of it. My family did that, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. I just wanted to capture the rhythm of that, doing that over and over. It was a very meaningful piece of my memories as well. So I was born in Oklahoma. I have always lived here. I think in a variety of ways it shapes my writing, probably mostly having to do with Mother Nature. I grew up on a farm in the southeastern part of the state, and it's been in my family since before statehood. And my family was farmers. That's how we made our living. We had cattle and grew peanuts and watermelons, and before my family, cotton, of course. And then beyond that, growing up, I would just walk for hours and just love to be in Mother Nature and taking time to notice the insects and the plants and the trees and the creeks and natural springs and just this whole marvelous world right under you if you just take time to be quiet and notice. I've always loved to write, and I think I gravitated toward poetry when I was pretty young. Just driven to capture ideas, whether it's in narrative form or more recently in poetry. One of my favorite quotes is by one of my favorite poets, and his name is David White, and he says that poetry is the art of overhearing yourself say things that you didn't know you knew. So I think that's very true. For me, when I write poetry, sometimes I just write things that I didn't know were there. I may start with a kernel of an idea, but as I start writing, up comes a turn of phrase or an idea that I just didn't know was in me. So I love the possibility that poetry brings like that. Sometimes I'm very intentional about writing, and I have an idea and I want to use this or that poetic style to capture it. But what I really love is just intentionally making space and time to be quiet and just sitting with my pencil and seeing what bubbles up.